Welcome to the Defense and Aerospace Report Daily Podcast. I'm your host, Vago Muradian. Our podcast is brought to you by Bell. Since 1935, Bell has been redefining flight. Learn more about its pioneering spirit at bellflight.com. And it's our honor to welcome Acting Secretary Tom Modly as our guest today. Our naval coverage is sponsored by Fincantieri Marinette Marine. Secretary Modly, thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Vago. Good to be here. Thanks.
Absolute pleasure. A lot of activity going on across the nation as everybody is grappling with the implications of coronavirus. You, CNO Gilday, the Surgeon General of the Navy, and the Master Chief Petty Officer of the Navy all had a press availability with reporters. The Navy has mobilized 2 hospital ships. USNS Mercy is underway and headed for Los Angeles, while the Comfort is going to be deployed shortly to New York City. But a number of ships at sea are reporting sailors who have been infected with the virus, including the carrier Roosevelt. What are you doing to safeguard the force while performing missions worldwide, which is the obligation of the force, while at the same time surging to protect the homeland?
Well, as you can imagine, and by the way you put it, it's a very delicate balancing act that we're trying to manage right now, but we're pretty good at doing these types of things, doing complicated things, and clearly this is something that surprised everybody, but we're adjusting on the fly and figuring out ways to both, do as you say, protect our force, but also to meet our national security requirements. With respect to sailors that are deployed and who have been tested positive so far, we only have 3 cases of that right now, and all 3 of those were on the Teddy Roosevelt. She was on her, had left Vietnam a couple weeks ago, and we were obviously observing everybody for 14 days to see what happened, and these cases popped up here on the 14th day, and so now we're trying to figure out sort of the forensics of who those particular sailors were close with during their time on the ship. We've actually taken the sailors off the ship and flown them to a military base hospital, and we're trying to understand, as quickly as possible who they came in contact with. I think there's maybe 13 to 15 that they've identified, and they've isolated them on the ship right now. And one of the advantages of, not that it's a great situation, but it's certainly it's a better situation having that happen on a ship that size, because it's a lot easier to create areas of isolation there, and also the medical facilities there are really top notch, as you know. So we're doing all we can, not just there, but with every other ship, to make sure that we're practicing the procedures that CDC has put out, and that's the best we can do right now.
Is there any concern on your part or CNO Gilday's part that this could end up becoming something that is going to operationally affect the Navy? Because one of the things you're priding yourselves on, I believe it was the CNO who said no deterrent patrols, for example, have been missed, that you guys are continuing to execute the mission. Do you have a sense or a concern that this could get bad enough to change operations?
To some extent, it has not impacted our strategic deterrent and any of those patrols to date. But it has impacted others. I mean, we've canceled some exercises already. There are things that are impacting across the fleet. Things like in our education curriculum, as you may know, the academy midshipmen haven't come back yet from spring break, and probably won't for this academic year. And so there are clearly things that are impacting us operationally, but we just have to weigh those and do some risk management to determine whether or not how severely those are impacting our ability to defend the nation. And so we're looking at all those things. So things like, our recruiting pipeline. Do we stop bringing sailors into recruiting and Marines into the recruiting stations? Right now, we've decided to continue with that process, but if the situation gets worse, we may have to think about what that means in terms of, because as you know, these things have ripple effects that cause readiness problems 6-12 months down the road. So I've tasked the services to look at that and really understand, okay, if this goes on for 2 months, if it goes on for 3 months, what are those ancillary effects? And it also impacts industrial base, what we do with billings with respect to milestones that are supposed to be met on acquisition programs, all those things. So we're looking at all those things.
In the press availability, you did mention how important it is to try to stay on schedule, especially at shipyards and throughout the industrial base. Obviously, DoD has declared the industrial base as a critical infrastructure. Let me take you to the question of how coronavirus is taxing society. It's taxing society unlike any crisis in decades. What are some of the lessons you're learning now that would improve the nation's capability to respond to a direct future national security crisis? Are there things that you guys are picking up as a senior leadership team?
Oh, for certain. I think we're trying to collect all those things, just with respect to how they would impact the Department of the Navy and our role in the Defense Department. We're collecting all kinds of lessons learned on this, as we should. But I've said many, many times before that the most predictable thing about the future is that it's going to be unpredictable. So the next crisis, I predict, is not going to be a virus crisis. It's going to be something else. And so that's why I put out the message to the department for months. Actually, since I got here as the undersecretary, that agility is going to be our key strategic capability that we have to think about, and how do we create that type of mindset in our people and in our platforms and everything else, because we have to be able to adjust and adapt to things that are going to surprise us, because things will surprise us.
Is the virus, obviously it's taking everybody's attention, it's taking a large amount of your bandwidth as well as leaders across the force, whether at the ship level or even at the fleet level. Is the virus going to derail the budget process? And will it hold up major announcement, for example, like the winner of the frigate competition and other programs?
As far as the overall budget process, I certainly hope it won't, but it's hard to say exactly what's going to happen. Traditionally, as you know, we go through the posture season, which we just completed, in February and March. And then the Congress holds continuous, hearings as well to get more detail, and has meetings to understand certain elements of the budget proposal. And then they do their markups in May, traditionally. So I don't know whether they're going to be able to do markups in May, given the crisis. I think it's certainly their intention to do so, but you just never know what's going to happen in the next week or the next 2 months. So hopefully it can stay on track. I know that there were certain senators and members of the House that were not exactly happy with the story we had to tell from the Navy perspective. If you saw the hearings, you probably saw that. So I'm sure there are things that they want to do to adjust our budget, as of course, we had to make some tough choices, but I assume that they're going to be working on those things because they see it as important. And I think there's also some potential that some of the things that they wanted to see may make their ways into some supplemental requests that are related to COVID. Second part of your question was about the frigate. Yeah, I instructed Secretary Gertz back in December to look at ways to accelerate that procurement decision. As you know, we had planned on making that in the last quarter of this fiscal year. And so they have been working hard to move that up. He assured me today that it will be ready to be made at a certain time, probably in the not too distant future. But we have to think through whether or not it makes sense to announce that, given everything else that might be going on in the country. And so we'll have to walk that through and understand whether or not it could wait, or maybe it shouldn't wait. I just don't know. But I would say that process, that particular process with respect to evaluating the bids, has not stopped. It's continued, and there have been no delays because of this particular crisis.
I'd like to start the conversation about aircraft carriers by asking you about USS Ford. Congratulations on the certification of the flight deck of the ship and its air traffic control capabilities. But 4 of the 7 elevators still aren't working. And Bloomberg's Tony Capaccio reported today that the Ford's toilets, which it shares in common with the George H.W. Bush, aren't working well as well, and that blockages could cost as much as $400,000 per flush, he reported. I understand that those are Government Accountability Office figures. What do you need to do at this point? And are there big, costly, but ultimately rewarding things that we need to do to, whether it's to cut those elevators out, to make some structural changes, to take out toilets that don't work, in order to accelerate the ability of this ship to deploy operation?
Okay, so let me clarify on the elevators. So the elevators, actually 4 are certified. The 5th one is about to be certified. I think they finished all the testing on that, and it passed all that. So the elevators, the 4 that have been certified, have had thousands and thousands of cycles on them with no problems. The 5th one, same thing, and it's about to get certified. So that leaves 6 more. They're looking at doing 2 more this year, and then finishing the rest of them off around next year this time. The misperception on the elevators is not that they're broken, it's just they haven't been installed completely yet. They're still being in the installation process, and that's just taking a lot longer than the shipyard thought it would take. And so that's the biggest challenge there. Once they're done and they've got them fitted, and it's largely the problem is related to the doors, because of the doors and hatches have to seal completely, or else the elevator won't proceed through the different various decks. And there's no way to override that apparently. So once of the 70 elevator doors and hatches that exist right now, only 20 of them there's 20 of them that are left to be done. So when you look at sort of the volume of work, even though there's still 5 elevators, there's the doors, which are the biggest problem. They've been knocking those down pretty well. Generally speaking, I can't speak to the issue about the toilets. Someone talked to me about that as they were heading down in the press conference today, so I don't know. I know that there was an article that Tony wrote today about that, but I haven't received any detail on that yet, so I can't really address it. But I will say that, as you may know, back in December, I put a big spotlight on the Ford and moved the PEO carriers down to Norfolk, the 2-star Jim Downey down there with his team to be there at the ship every single day to get it going. And you're right, even despite this crisis, they just certified the flight deck and continue to make significant progress. So I'm actually very pleased with where the Ford is right now, despite, articles that may be written about this problem or that problem. It's made significant progress in the last 6 months, and I think pretty soon it's going to be the only ship that we have on the East Coast that really is qualified to do all of our carrier certifications this summer and into the fall are going to be done on the Ford. So it's going to be contributing to the mission and to the operation of the Navy starting in the next couple of months.
And we did earlier this year have an extraordinary visit out there with Secretary Gertz, and it was a pleasure. And obviously our colleague Chris Cavus has been covering the issue closely and had an opportunity to talk to you.
I think the most telling thing about that ship is to talk to the sailors on the ship and see how they feel about it, particularly the ones that have served on a Nimitz carrier before. They understand the difference. They recognize how much more advanced this carrier is, how much easier it is to do and safer it is for them to do their jobs. Many of them told me they never want to go back to a Nimitz carrier after being on this one. So, and that's for a ship that's still sort of working through its shakedowns here. So I think that's a very telling sign. And generally, I think you get to ground truth when you talk to them.
Absolutely. And it's always a pleasure to get Hayes Gray and underway, and especially get an opportunity to talk to sailors and also be encouraged by a command's leadership to do that, which is generally a sign of confidence in where the ship is in its progress. Let me go to the next topic. For several months, the Marine Corps Commandant General David Berger has been talking about the need for a fundamentally different strategy that the force has to have, especially to potentially fight great powers like China and Russia, but China in particular. The Wall Street Journal's Michael Gordon is reporting that the Marine Corps is about to release its first new strategy in a generation. If you wouldn't mind, walk us through the major elements of that new strategy and how the Navy Marine Corps team are going to execute this strategy together in an integrated way or integrated operational concepts.
Yeah, and I think that's the most important element of this is that it is an integrated strategy. It's bringing the Marines back into an operational focus on what they do as part of the Navy Marine Corps team. General Berger talked a lot about this during hearings. He was asked a lot of questions about this, and I think that's what you'll see is the desire to have a smaller, lighter, more distributed force, and that includes operating off of ships that frankly we don't have in the inventory right now and barely on the drawing board. So when you saw me talk in the posture hearings about our future force structure, I talked a lot about the fact that there are several ships that, regardless of which analysis you look at, if you look at the one that was done here in the Navy or the one that was done by CAPE at Office of the Secretary of Defense, or CSBA did a study, they all identify ship types that we don't have right now, both unmanned, large unmanned surface vessels, medium-sized unmanned surface vessels, unmanned underwater vessels, as well as these new lighter amphibs and combat support vessels. My view on this whole thing is we need to move out on those, regardless of what that end state is in terms of the numbers, because we won't reach those numbers for a number of years, but we need to start moving out on those. And that, to me, is the big departure between what the 2016 force structure assessment said and the direction that we're headed now, based on what the Marine Corps is trying to do with Commandant Berger's strategy and vision, based on where Admiral Gilday wants to go, and based where sort of as a department we think we need to head with our force structure.
When do you think we're going to see the integrated force structure assessment? You were expecting to see it earlier this year before the Surface Navy Association. That was delayed. You had some questions about that. Other folks have had questions about it. And there are folks who are looking and saying 355 or 420 something, if you add in all unmanned ships, is likely unrealistic. What are we going to see when we see this
So the Navy and Marine Corps, the Commandant and the CNO, delivered that report to me. It's called the Integrated Naval Force Structure Assessment. They delivered that to me in the latter part of January. I've been evaluating that. CAPE delivered one as well to the Secretary of Defense. He looked at both of those and felt like there was more work that needed to be done to either reconcile differences between the two or think more creatively about future options. I think also for him, it's been an educational process, having not spent a lot of time with the Navy in the past. And so he asked Secretary Norquist to put together a team, sort of a tiger team, to sort of hash these things out, look at multiple scenarios, et cetera. And so that's what we are now participating in. He's asked me to hold off on releasing anything. What I've tried to explain to him is that this is an iterative thing for us too. I mean, this is sort of a starting point for us. What I'm trying to do is change the way the Navy thinks about this and not say, all right, we're going to do a force structure assessment every 4 years and lock it in. And it has to be more iterative and more dynamic. And so while this work is going on, we're developing the process to work with the war colleges and others, academia, as well as our own people, to war game this substantially, understand what the implications are for various scenarios. Because yes, we're focused on great power competition, and it's largely China and Russia. But as I've said before, things come and surprise us. So how well is this force going to be able to adjust to those types of surprises? And so we have to war game that out, and that's what we're doing right now. The work that Secretary Norquist is driving is called the Future Fleet Architecture. The expectation is that that's going to come out sometime this summer. As a complementary piece to that, I commissioned a future aircraft carrier study to look at how the carrier then informs that whole force structure. So we're doing that all sort of simultaneously.
And that's one of the things that I wanted to talk to you about. Since you entered office, you and I have spoken quite a lot about the future of the aircraft carrier. And one of the challenges that we face is that we have adversaries that are specifically targeting those ships and that capability. And you realize that when you get into a hypersonic world, even the most survivable ships very rapidly become unsurvivable. Walk us through what you want the panel to achieve. And, is it that we need many more slightly smaller, less expensive ships? What are some of the foundational guidance you're giving the team as we go beyond the last 4 Ford-class carriers that we're obligated to acquiring?
The one reality, as I'm sure you're aware of, is we're going to have these carriers are our most expensive capital asset, and we're going to have them in the fleet for a number of years, regardless of what future direction we head in. So, for example, the Ford's going to be in the fleet for the next 50 years. The Miller is going to be in the fleet for 50 plus 10 years, starting, when it gets in the fleet 10 years from now. The question is, what do we do, first of all, with the existing carrier fleet to make them more survivable? What can we do to make them more survivable? How do we fight with them in a future hypersonic or non-hypersonic war? Or how do we use them, and what's the best way to do that? But then going forward, what do? We have this industrial base. We have to sustain that industrial base. So we have to look at, what are some alternatives for a future carrier? Should it be smaller? Should it be lighter? Should it be conventionally powered rather than nuclear powered? All those things are on the table. And I'm not constraining thinking. I've got a team here that's working on this. They're going to talk to a lot of people. It's going to be very similar to the way we did the Education for Sea Power study, where we went out and talked to a lot of different people and tried to consolidate around some general themes. And then I have a senior review panel that's being chaired, honorary chairman is Senator Warner, John Warner, as well as John Layman's on this and several others that will sort of help us come up with some decision points. And those decision points will be presented to the Secretary, and we can make some decisions on what direction we want to go. But it's definitely not going to be a discussion that's being held just in the halls of the Pentagon. We're going to talk to industry. We're going to talk to some outside of the box thinkers as well, may or may not even be in sort of the maritime business or the maritime security business. So we're just trying to get very, very open-minded about this, because these ships are very, very expensive, but they also are a critical part of our overall industrial base. These ships employ 50,000+ people, the construction of these ships, in over, I think, 46 states or something like that. So as I mentioned in my statement about this, you can't just turn that on and off like a faucet. So you have to be very thoughtful about what you do and how you want to use them going forward.
A lot of the way that we like to think about warfighting is based on individual weapon platforms, whereas it seems like the Chinese approach, when you read their writing, is much more about sort of systems warfare, to attack command and control nodes, to whether in the rear or whether even in the civilian context. How are you factoring that element into what that future architecture looks like, given the adversary may have a very different idea about how they're going to fight us than we may have?
Well, yeah, I think that's all part of the intelligence gathering that we do in this process, and try to understand, what our adversaries are all about and how they intend to match up against what we have. And I think the best way to defeat that is to keep them guessing, be a lot less predictable, be a lot more distributed, give them more complicated targeting to worry about, and also have the ability to, from a network perspective, if parts of your network go down, to reconfigure that network, or have platforms that can reconfigure that network in a localized situation if they in fact become isolated. So all those things are factoring into our thinking on this. The idea is to have a much more distributed force, a much more agile force, much more light, faster, less cost per platform. Because if you look at sort of our fleet, and I know you're well aware of this, but that 600 ship Navy that we had, that we nearly achieved in the 80s, the average cost of that ship in real dollars of those ships was about $1 billion. That was the average. Today, our 293 or 295 ship Navy is about $2 billion in real dollars per ship. And so that's a trend we have to reverse somehow, because we just can't afford it over time. We need more ships. We need more smaller ships that still have to be capable. They're going to need to have a lot of electrical power generation on them for a variety of different reasons, some of which you just cited. And so that's what we're looking at.
Sir, thanks very much for all of your time. Really appreciate it, Ed, and look forward to talking to you again soon. Thank you so much.
Okay, Vago. Thanks for your time. Take care.
And thanks to all of you for joining us. Please follow our daily podcasts with top government, military, industry, and thought leaders at Defense and Aerospace Report, and subscribe to our weekly newsletter. Follow us on Twitter at DEFAERO Report. That's at DEFAERO Report. Like us on Facebook at Defense and Aerospace Report. And check us out on LinkedIn. Check out our weekly Cyber Report sponsored by Northrop Grumman, and our weekly Technology Report sponsored by General Motors Defense. Since 1935, Bell has been redefining flight. Learn more about its pioneering spirit at bellflight.com. Thanks again to Bell for their generous sponsorship, and we'll see you again tomorrow.